there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 10. And just a little catch up on what happened in the last issue. We saw Swamp Thing finally return to the Louisiana swamps, and he was hoping to go back to the original barn that Alec Holland was blown up in so that he could use the chemicals and lab equipment there to create, hopefully, a cure for himself. But when he got there, he saw that all the equipment was actually being used already by an alien who had crash landed in the swamps. Of course, Swamp Thing was very angered by this, so him and the alien fought, and the alien won, but it was very sad that it thought it killed Swamp Thing. And in the background, we saw that the government of the United States, of course, was aware that the alien had landed somewhere in Louisiana, so they sent a military team there along with Matt Cable as a guide, and they eventually found the barn and the alien inside. And even though it was stronger than them, the alien didn't want to hurt any more people on this planet, so it kind of gave itself up. It let itself be captured. But luckily for the alien, Swamp Thing was not dead, and now that he had had a couple hours to cool off, he was actually pretty upset that these men captured this alien. So while the men were distracted and arguing whether they should kill the alien or bring it back, Swamp Thing was able to free it and help it get back to its spaceship, which apparently had at least been repaired enough to take off, because the alien does so, but unfortunately, it was not fully repaired, and the spaceship nosedived and crashed and exploded, killing the alien inside. And just like almost all these issues, Swamp Thing then walked away very sad from the wreckage because he had made an alien friend and now he was gone. So first things first, with issue 10, we got the cover. We see Swamp Thing is fighting with some humanoid creatures. They look like the Unmen from Anton Arcane. And we see that this issue is written by Len Wein with art by Bernie Wrightson. And we start off on the first page with a shirtless white man running through the swamps, and he has shackles and chains on his wrists, and as he's running, the narration says, "He has been running for many hours now, ignoring the sear pains that lance through his chest, and at last, he has left the mournful baying of the bloodhounds far behind. His name is Hunk Dory, number 2431975. He is a fugitive from a chain gang. In his time, he has been convicted of murdering many men, and he figures that, at this late date, another victim, more or less, will not make a bit of difference." And the reason why it's saying this is because Hunk is coming up on an old black woman who is cooking something in a pot outside, so he's planning on killing her, it seems. But luckily for the old woman, Swamp Thing just happens to be nearby, and he's kind of seeing all this through the trees, and the narration continues, "But to the huge, shambling, moss-encrusted monstrosity standing in the shadows at the clearing's edge, it makes all the difference in the world." And we also see on this page that the name of the issue is The Man Who Would Not Die. And as we turn the page, we see Hunk Dory, the escaped prisoner, begins to choke the old woman with the chains. And he says to her, "Don't know what you're cooking in the pot of yours, old woman, but I've been running so long, hurting so bad, feeling so mean, that I ain't about to ask for no handout now. I'm just gonna knock you off and take what I..." But he's cut off as someone yells, "No!" And Hunk thinks it's just a regular person, and before he even looks, he says, "Huh? Ain't nobody tells Hunk Dory what to do." But then Swamp Thing comes out of the tree line, and the narration says, "But the Swamp Thing lumbers out of the darkness then, dripping a mossy wet trail behind him, and the blood of the man named Hunk Dory suddenly runs colder than it ever has before. And when Hunk sees Swamp Thing, he says, 'Lord Almighty, what in the name of Mary is that?' So Hunk lets go of the old woman to prepare for a fight with Swamp Thing, and luckily she doesn't seem to be too injured. But as Swamp Thing comes closer to him, Hunk yells out, 'I don't know what kind of monster you keep as a pet, old witch, but Hunk Dory ain't never run from no fight with nothing, and I ain't about to start now.'" And as Hunk Dory was about to swing his chain at Swamp Thing, it seems he is finally overcome by the wounds he sustained while he was on the run, and he falls into Swamp Thing's arms dead. And as Swamp Thing looks at Hunk Dory very confused, the old lady says, "No use fussing over him, child. He's stone dead. Ain't nobody that can live too long with that many bullets in him, except maybe you, I wager. Suppose you're wondering why your old Auntie Bellum is just sitting here talking, instead of scooting away from you like that old devil was on my tail." And Swamp Thing sets down the body of Hunk Dory, and he walks over to the woman who called herself Auntie Bellum, and she continues saying, "Just too old, I reckon. Seen too many downright awful things to care much anymore. Yes'm, child, this old land's got a powerful mean way of treating the folks what lives here. Not that it was always this way, mind you. Time was this land was rich and green, and so almighty beautiful, the good Lord himself must have envied it. Then as we turn the page, we go into a flashback where Auntie Bellum is narrating, and we see slaves working in a cotton field, and her narration says, "There was a cotton plantation here then, a great warm white brick building fronted with tall marble columns, bordered with roses as sweet as a summer's dawn, and for a slave plantation, life might have been almost pleasant if it wasn't for the monster that owned it." Then we get a panel of the plantation owner, and we see he is a white man, of course, with bushy red hair and big mutton chops that actually connect to his mustache. And he's looking very angry. And one thing that's pretty creepy, I think that the art team does, is they don't give his eyes any pupils in any of these panels, which really amplifies the evilness of him. And Auntie Bellum continues her narration saying, "Samson Parmenter his name was, but they might as well have just called him Lucifer, Beelzebub, or Satan. A cussed mean one he was, born with something missing in his soul, born with a powerful need to hurt, to pain knows what served him." We get a panel of him about to whip on a slave that I guess angered him, and the narration continues. "The slaves, they all hated Parmenter, but there was nothing they could do, until the day Parmenter took a shine to a pretty young thing named Elsbeth. Now Elsbeth, she wouldn't have no part of Parmenter, told him she was already promised to another, and Parmenter, well, he decided he'd just as soon have her torn limb from limb as spit on her." And then we get a panel of Elsbeth, after having rejected Parmenter, having ropes tied to each arm, and basically she is the middle of a game of tug-of-war with the other white men who work for Parmenter. Then we see a very large, strong slave come out from the crowd of slaves that are being made to watch this, and he looks very angry, and the narration continues saying, "That was Parmenter's biggest mistake, because that's when Black Jubal stepped out from the slaves. Seems he was the one Elsbeth was promised to. Now, Black Jubal, he just stood right up to old Parmenter, told him off straight to his face. And Parmenter, he didn't like that. No, he didn't like that at all." And under this narration, we get a panel of Parmenter looking at Black Jubal evilly, and we can actually see that Black Jubal already has his right arm cut off just above the elbow, so it seems he's already done horrible things to Black Jubal. And as we turn the page, we see Black Jubal tied to the trunk of a tree, and Parmenter is walking up to him with a torch in his hands, and once again, all the other slaves are being forced to watch this. And the narration continues. "Now, Parmenter couldn't tear Jubal's limbs off. He'd already taken one arm when Jubal was just a child, so that monster decided to burn Jubal instead. Said it was the way all good martyrs died." Then we get a panel of the face of Black Jubal looking horrified as flames begin to creep into the bottom of the panel, and the narration says, "Well, as them flames looked up around Jubal's body, the big man swore an oath, said even death wouldn't stop him from dealing with Parmenter for good, said Parmenter's breed would pay in kind for the almighty sins they'd committed against their fellow man." Then we cut to after Jubal has been burned, and all the slaves are still being treated horribly. We see one man is again in the middle of a bunch of ropes that are tied to each of his limbs as men play tug-of-war with him, and the narration continues saying, "But Parmenter, he just laughed, and once Black Jubal was burned and gone, he went right on back to having his fun, and if the sins he committed before were bad, them that followed was worse. Almost as if he was daring Black Jubal to rise up on out of the ground and make him stop like he swore he would. Now the slaves, all they could do was suffer and pray somebody else would come along to stop Parmenter. And one night, somebody, or something, did. They heard noises from the old plantation, sounds like the agonized screaming of something unhuman. And when they rushed inside, they found Mr. Parmenter in the foyer, in the living room, in the pantry, and in the den. Something had torn Samson Parmenter limb from limb. And after all those horrible panels of slaves being beaten and killed, we get a very satisfying panel of the head of Samson Parmenter with a very terrified look on his face. Hopefully he was alive as all the other parts were ripped off by whatever killed him. Then we cut out of the flashback to present day where Swamp Thing is sitting and listening to this story from Auntie Bellum. And as she lights her corncob pipe, she says, "Things kind of fell apart after that, child. Most of the slaves, they run away, let the old plantation tumble into ruin. But old antebellum, well, I just didn't have nowheres else to go. Not that I minds, child. I know it's for the best. When you get as old as old auntie, you'll knows all kinds of stuff. Like, I knows that the eyes of unholy things are staring at us right this very second. And then she looks over into the woods, and Swamp Thing follows her gaze, and he thinks, the eyes of what? And to his surprise, he actually does see people peering out from the tree line, and he immediately starts running at them, and he thinks to himself, the old woman is right. I can see the eyes gleaming out of the darkness, and I think I'd better find out who they belong to. And as Swamp Thing runs towards the creatures, we can see, what looks like a human foot and hands as they rush off into the darkness. And as Swamp Thing follows them, the narration says, moving his great shambling bulk far faster than one could believe possible, the creature who was once Dr. Alec Holland pursues his grotesque quarry through the shadowy swamp, and some small mode of memory tugs at his sluggish mind. He's seen this peculiar, awkward gait before. If only he could remember when. So we see two figures running away from him, and one of them is running on two legs like a human, but he's got really, really long arms, and the other individual is the torso and top half of a man, except it also has a man's head where its lower abdomen is, and it is running on its hands. But Swamp Thing can't really see them too clearly, it's a little too dark, and as he tries to make them out, he thinks, they move too quickly, stay too close to the shadows, but they seem to be heading for that clearing up ahead, and maybe there I can. But Swamp Thing's thoughts are cut off as he gets into the clearing, and we see a very wide-eyed stare from Swamp Thing, and the narration over this panel says, cautiously, the root-entangled monstrosity shuffles to the secluded clearing's edge, and his roomy red-rimmed eyes suddenly go wide with the shock of recognition, and the depressing realization that the old tired adage is true. Only the good die young, while the evil live on, possibly forever. And under this narration, we get a full-page splash of Swamp Thing walking out into the clearing, which is actually a cemetery, and we see the unmen of Dr. Arcane walking towards him, but there's one that looks a little bit different. The one in the very front that seems to be leading them is more humanoid. He's standing on two legs, but his arms are extremely long, and he has a very large hump back, and its face looks like it was split down the middle, but someone tried to sew it up who wasn't a doctor, and it healed very wrong, leaving a large scar above his upper lip, giving the creature a permanent sneer. And the narration over this panel says, before the astonished Swamp Thing rise a handful of the hideous unmen, synthetically created beings the mossy man-brute thought long dead at the foot of a Balkan peak, now horribly, unimaginably resurrected, to stand as grinning mockeries in a kingdom of the dead. And the head unman says, welcome, my mossy friend. We have been expecting you. And Swamp Thing stares at confusion at this unman that he doesn't recognize, and the unman says, ah, I see confusion in your eyes. You recognize my unmen, but not me. Then permit me to reintroduce myself. I am Arcane, and I have come to claim what is mine. Seize him, my pets! So all the unmen rush Swamp Thing, and they jump on his body trying to tackle him. But it seems Swamp Thing wasn't really prepared for this, and the unmen were. So one of the unmen actually gets behind Swamp Thing's legs as the others jump on top of him, and this actually trips Swamp Thing and he falls to the ground. And Anton Arcane steps over him and says, do not attempt to rise, my friend, or we will be forced to repeat this performance more violently than before. So Swamp Thing doesn't try to get up, he just lays on the ground looking at Anton, and the unmen hold him down by his arms, and Anton begins to talk, saying, undoubtedly you are wondering how I survived from the fall of my tower, and how my magnificent mind came to be in this gross, misshapen form. And since you, above anyone else in this world, would appreciate the irony of it all, I shall tell you. Then we get a flashback after the events of issue 2, but before issue 3, because we can see the body of Anton Arcane is laying limp on one of the outcrops of the mountain that were below his castle. And we see the unmen find his body and take it back to his castle where the lab is intact. So this has to be before issue 3 happened, because the Patchwork Man exploded his lab at the beginning of that issue. So over these panels, the narration says, in truth, I did not survive the fall, though the spark of life remained within me. I had shattered every single bone in my body. Those few remaining of my unmen, under the direction of the living brain Cranius, carried my broken body to a secret laboratory, where under my semi-telepathic control, Cranius supervised the production of a miracle. Then we see the unmen doing surgery, and the narration continues. From a vast supply of component parts I had stored there for just such an emergency, they constructed a synthetic body to house my undamaged mind. But without my masterful hands to guide them, the results of the operation were somewhat less than perfect. Then we get a panel of Arcane leading the unmen onto a beach, and the narration says, realizing I could not spend an eternity in this cumbersome mortal form, I resolved once more to possess your body, for as you know, my earlier tests of it have proved it almost indestructible. With Cranius's telepathic power homed in on your mind, we set off in pursuit of you. And since these synthetic forms require no food or rest, it did not take us terribly long to swim the Atlantic Ocean. Tracking you back here to your swampy home took only a few days longer. And now the prize I so faithfully sought is within my grasp. We will take you back with us to my hidden laboratory, and then... But Arcane is cut off as Swamp Thing begins to stand. And as he does, of course, he's fighting off the unmen that are struggling to pin him down again, and Swamp Thing thinks to himself, and then you'll steal my body. You may think you can, madmen, but you haven't got a flaming chance in hell. And at the word hell, Swamp Thing breaks the grasp of the unmen that were trying to hold him back, and he rushes Anton, and Anton yells out, watch him, you fools! He's breaking free! But it's too late. Swamp Thing is rushing towards Arcane, but it seems Arcane is up to the challenge because he yells out, so, my friend, you seek to make me earn your body. Very well then, if you insist. And then right as Swamp Thing is about to reach Arcane, Arcane shows off some new moves that he can do with his new body, and he actually leans back on his very long arms and kicks his feet up, kind of like a gorilla would. And he ends up kicking Swamp Thing right in the chin, knocking Swamp Thing backward onto the ground. And as Anton does this, he continues saying, it will only make my eventual victory that much sweeter. And of course, now that Swamp Thing's on the ground, the other unmen rush to grab him again, but Anton raises his hand and says, stay back, my pets, stay back. If I cannot defeat Holland alone, I do not deserve to own his body. But as Anton is distracted, this gives time for Swamp Thing to recover, and as he stands up from the ground, he thinks, an impressive speech, Arcane. A shame your words are as hollow as your head. And then Swamp Thing links his fingers together and brings both his hands down, crashing on Anton's head. But it only momentarily stuns Anton, and as Anton recovers, he says, well struck, Doctor. You are a most worthy adversary. It would seem I'm in for the battle of my life. Then very quickly, he raises his really long arm and smacks Swamp Thing in the head, again throwing Swamp Thing off balance, and he says, a pity, then, that the battle will be such a short one. And then they begin to grapple each other, and Anton is in the power position because he's on top, and Swamp Thing is underneath, but they're both still standing, but Swamp Thing is definitely trying to keep his balance. And as Anton lands another blow, he says, you forget, Dr. Holland. I've studied your body. I know all its weak and strong points. So it will not be too difficult for me to conquer you without harming your mossy form. After all, I'll need a body that's in perfect condition if I'm going to enslave the... But he's cut off as Swamp Thing does an upkick from the ground and lands right on Anton's chin. But Anton doesn't get knocked out or anything. He's still above Swamp Thing, and he raises his fists almost like it's going to be a killing blow. But as he does, we notice the area around this cemetery begins to fill up with fog. And over this panel of the fog creeping in, the narration says, a sudden gust of wind wells up at the mention of the word. And if you didn't catch it, the word was enslave. So Anton said the word slave in the middle of a slave graveyard. And it seems like his evil and this word has awoken something supernatural. And the narration continues saying, a cold wind whose whisper seems the moan of tormented souls. But those who battle in this grisly arena choose to ignore the wind, for the elements are as nothing before their own primordial hate. So Anton grabs Swamp Thing by the neck with one hand and begins to crush, and as he raises his other hand for another blow, he yells, fall, Holland! Why don't you fall? I'd think a man such as you would prefer to perish now. rather than live on as a slave. And at the speaking of that word again, the fog gets even more thick and the wind begins to blow even harder. And the narration says, again, the word is spoken, and the wind grows harsher still, its whispered moan becoming more like a murmur. And we cut back to the fight, and now Swamp Thing has both of his hands on Anton's one hand that's strangling him, and he's trying to pull the arm away from his throat. But it doesn't seem like Anton's grip is breaking, and he looks Swamp Thing right in the eyes and says, "Stop struggling, Doctor, and die. It's really for the best, you know. Think, Holland. Imagine what it will be like to exist in my world. A world where my every wish will be a command. A world where all humanity will serve as slaves to my power." And once again, the fog gets thicker, and the wind blows harder, and the narration says, and the murmuring grows deeper, coming in frustrated howls. And as we turn the page, we see Anton is landing one final blow to Swamp Thing, and as he does this, he yells, "You should consider yourself fortunate, Doctor, that you will not be around to see such a world." And then Swamp Thing falls backward, passed out on the ground, and the other men gather around Swamp Thing's limp body, and Anton Arcane stands above him and says, "It's finished, my pets. The body I have so long coveted will soon be mine. We need only return with it to my hidden laboratory, transplant my brain into its mossy confines, then begin a well-calculated wave of terror that will eventually sweep mankind's undeserved freedom from the face of the earth and leave Arcane the undisputed master of the world." And at the word master, that seems to have been the last straw for whatever's going on supernaturally. And the narration says, and with that, the windswept moans, the gusty murmurings become a muffled cry of outrage and despair, a sound even the megalomaniacal Arcane and his synthetic servants cannot long ignore. And we see the unmen turn around back to the cemetery and they look kind of scared, and the narration continues. Thus they stand transfixed as the mournful cry congeals into the anguished, hysterical voices of creatures no longer truly of this world, voices that scream out for the righteous revenge so many years denied them. And the screaming grows louder, more desperate, till the ancient wooden headstones seem to shudder at the sound, trembling in mock fear of what they know must shortly come. Then a tombstone falls, and another quickly follows, and at last, the musty cemetery ground erupts in unnatural fury, hurling the remaining headstones skyward, shriveling the yellowed grass, spewing up great chunks of decaying dirt, freeing those who have slept a most fitful sleep beneath this unhallowed soil for a countless score of years. So like the narration said, the tombstones begin to fall over and the ground heaved up, and then in front of Anton Arcane and his unmen, we see the ghosts of Black Jubal and all the other slaves from this plantation. And as Anton looks at these ghosts, he says, Who are you all? What business have you here?" And Black Jubal answers, "We have come to repay a debt." And then Jubal and Anton both stare at each other for a minute, and the narration says, the big black man grows silent then, as he and his somber companions move slowly, hesitantly, forward, their dark eyes almost glowing in anticipation. And Anton, in turn, wonders if perhaps his own synthetic eyes have suddenly gone faulty, for he would swear he can see through the grim-visaged throng approaching him. Then we see what Swamp Thing's doing, and he's looking up in disbelief as well, and his narration says, and the Swamp Thing? His moss-hooded eyes grow wide in surprise, as he remembers the tale he'd heard scant minutes before, of a great black giant who died at the stake, a giant with only one arm. So the ghosts of the slaves begin to grab all of the unman and Arcane, and the narration says, Arcane and his minions have not heard the tale of Black Jubal's sworn vengeance, but even they can recognize the spectral company's intentions, so they attempt to run, an instant too late. But Black Jubal and the other slaves don't go for Swamp Thing, so Swamp Thing begins to sit up, but Jubal turns to him and says, No, my friend, this has nothing to do with you, so sleep, sleep. And Swamp Thing does just that. He falls back, totally asleep, and the narration says, At that, the rheumy eyes close, the moss-encumbered head lolls back, and the man-brute sleeps, and sleeping dreams of laboratory explosions and all-embracing swamps, of hideous transformations and resentful resurrections, of all the terrible things that have made his life the horror it is today. But even so, the horror the Swamp Thing dreams is as nothing compared to the horrors he would see had he not been so mercifully put to rest. Then we see the ghost slaves pulling on the limbs of Anton Arcane, reenacting the scene we saw before of the masters torturing the slaves on the plantation. Then we cut to a very foggy scene of the forest because I guess we can't see exactly what the ghost slaves are doing, but the narration says, "The screaming is loud and long and frightening, and laced with maniacal laughter that sends snakes skittering away into the underbrush, night birds sailing off into an angry sky, and at last the screaming stops." Then as we turn the page, we cut to sometime later, and we see Swamp Thing getting up from the ground, kind of dazed, and the narration says, "It is almost dawn when the Swamp Thing awakens, rubbing the filth of sleep from his eyes, to find he is alone. Arcane, Black Jubal, the others are gone, and the centuries-old cemetery is just as it was before. Or is it?" And Swamp Thing notices that a couple of the tombstones have been reset, and they are now in like a straight line. There are 7 in a row, and the middle tombstone is very, very tall compared to the others. And as Swamp Thing approaches them, he hesitates for a second because, there was ghosts and whatnot, and the narration says, "And the Swamp Thing wonders if perhaps he should wait for the rising sun to examine this new mystery more closely. He wonders this for only an instant, then sanity prevails, and he turns away, shambling off into the misty half-light of morning. For there really is no need for him to stay. In his heart, the Swamp Thing knows what he will find." And under that narration, we see a line of the tombstones, and the middle one that's the biggest one says Arcane on it. So it seems the ghost slaves have killed Anton and his unmen and buried their bodies here in the cemetery. Then we turn the page, and we get an epilogue, and the narration says, "Dawn is in full bloom when the shambling swamp brute at last finds his way back to the clearing where a certain ancient woman had sat the night before, only to find she is," then we see Swamp Thing think, "gone. The shack, the cauldron, antebellum, all of them, gone." And then Swamp Thing looks around confused and he thinks, "This is the right clearing. I recognize the foliage, but in God's name, what happened to the house that was here last night? Have I gone mad? Did I imagine it all happened?" But just as he thinks that, he looks at a bush that was near Antebellum when she was telling the story, and something inside of the bush is sparkling from the rays of the sun hitting it. So Swamp Thing goes over to it, and he begins to push the branches aside, and he thinks, "Sunlight, glinting off something in the bushes. Could it be her cauldron? Or..." But as he pushes the branches away, he reveals a tombstone that was underneath the bush. And as Swamp Thing reads the name on the tombstone, he thinks, "A gravestone. And that inscription. Elsbeth Bellum. Black Jubal's Elsbeth, I'm certain. So that's why she had nowhere else to go. Then, she wasn't here last night. It was all a dream." So it seems that all this supernatural stuff was too much for Swamp Thing to handle, so he's just trying to lie to himself and tell himself it was all a dream. But as he walks away, we do see him step on a corncob pipe, which is what Antebellum was smoking out of last night. So that's just confirming to us, the reader, that all of that did happen last night, but Swamp Thing is in denial. And as he walks away, he thinks, "It was all a dream. I have to keep telling myself that it was only a dream. And maybe someday I'll make myself believe it." So as he tries to talk himself into believing it was a dream, we see him walk into the woods, and behind him, there's a very creepy looking worm, I guess it is. It kind of looks like a centipede with octopus suckers for legs, and it looks like it has consciousness because it's staring at Swamp Thing very ominously. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So we got a bit of a heavy one this week with the subject of slavery, and obviously this being written in the 70s, there's probably some stuff that's a little outdated, but I pretty much read everything word for word. So I think this writing team did the best job they could incorporating this heavy topic of slavery into a comic book story. And I feel like they didn't pull any punches with how horrible slavery was. So good on them for doing that and not trying to sugarcoat it or something. And with issue 10, this is actually the last issue that Bernie writes and draws of Swamp Thing. So it's a pretty intense issue to go out on. So with that, if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains@comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.